Hey everyone, Happy New Year. 2024 is here, and we're probably going to have a very interesting year economically. So what I want to do in this video is share with you my 2024 predictions on some of the major economic topics that affect us all. Now with that said, I do have my degree in finance, and I love looking into the data when it comes to this stuff, but I also understand that I am not God, and there are people with access to much more data than I have who still get this stuff wrong every single year. So as we go through these predictions, just understand that we are all human and all we can do is make our best presumptions based on the data available. It's always important to do your own due diligence and to use my video along with many other videos and sources of information to come up with your own positions on these things. One more thing, this is going to be a two-part video because there is just so much to cover. So in part one, this video, we're going to cover my predictions for interest rates, inflation, the job market, the soft landing that might or might not happen, potential recession, as well as financial stability. And in part two, which will come out this Friday, so don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, we will cover wages, the real estate market, the car market, the stock market, and the bond market. So don't forget to turn on the bell notification as well so you don't miss that video. All right, let's begin. So let's start with the one thing that is going to affect basically the entire economy all year, and that is interest rates and how high or low they are. Now, right off the bat, interest rates should be lower by the end of 2024. In fact, the Fed is estimating about 3 to 4 rate cuts for this year. And the consensus is that the average federal funds rate will probably be around 4.5 to 4.6% by the end of 2024. Now with that said, for everyone who's holding out for the potential of an extremely low mortgage, our sub 3% mortgages that we are all accustomed to probably won't return anytime soon. Now mortgages will continue to get less expensive as the federal funds rate comes down, but I don't see any sub 3% mortgages for 2024. Now all that data is readily available and the consensus is pretty strong, but what most people aren't talking about is sticky inflation and how that might affect the Fed's interest rate policies. Which leads me into my next prediction, and that has to do with inflation. I think inflation will be a lot more sticky than most people are expecting. And I think it will be more difficult than expected to bring inflation below 3% permanently. And you can actually see this currently happening when you look into services inflation. Services inflation is very important because this is a service-based economy, and that key metric is still above 5%. So, as the Federal Reserve begins to cut their interest rates, I think there is a very significant chance that inflation flares up again. Now, am I 100% certain? No. I think the Fed has done a decent job at curbing inflation, but I think there is a very real, non-zero chance that inflation flares up again as the Fed starts cutting its federal funds rate. You kind of have to see high interest rates like antibiotics. Long term, they hurt the body / the economy, as in they can send us into a recession, but they are needed to cure the problem, in this case inflation. If those antibiotics, in this case high interest rates, stop being applied too early, the bacteria, or in this case inflation, can come back stronger. And this is a very real possibility that we face. And this primarily has to do with the job market. Remember, this is a service-based economy. So when you see high service inflation, it is directly tied to the job market because a large portion of employees have service-based jobs. And that leads me to my next prediction. The job market. I think that as long as we don't have a major recession, job growth and wage growth will remain strong. This is good because wages need to catch up with the new high prices that we are all living with. This unfortunately can also be bad for inflation because if the job market is still strong today in the face of high interest rates, when those interest rates are cut this year, the job market and wages might flourish, which again can unfortunately raise prices, especially in a service-based economy. And this again makes the case for a potential sticky inflation situation in 2024. Basically, everyone's already cheering that the Federal Reserve has done its job. And while I do agree that it looks that way and that we'll probably be fine, I tend to be more cautious than most when it comes to inflation and whether the job is truly done or not. And this leads me to my next prediction, and that relates to a soft landing. Remember, a soft landing just means that the Federal Reserve is able to bring down inflation to the target rate without sending the economy into a recession. And when you look at the data, it does seem like that is happening. Unemployment is under 4%. Wages are growing and they are outpacing inflation. Finally. And GDP is above 5%, which is very high, especially for a mature economy like the United States. So all else being equal, it does look like we're headed for a soft landing. The major concern for me here again is sticky inflation. If inflation comes back as the Fed cuts rates, the Fed might have to pause those rate cuts. And that means that this economy will remain in an elevated interest rate environment for longer. And the longer it remains in a high interest rate environment, the more likelihood for a recession. Remember, higher interest rates, lower economic activity. The longer it remains in a higher interest rate environment, the more chance that that lower economic activity spirals into a recession. And that leads me to my next prediction in regards to recession. Even with my concerns about inflation, I personally do not think that we're headed for a recession, at least in the next 12 months. But it does become increasingly more difficult to predict with any sort of accuracy the further out that you look. Now, we do have to talk about this. Just because we're not in a technical recession doesn't mean it doesn't feel like a recession for the average American, which is the next thing I want to talk about. But one more thing before I do that, a true recession can still happen in one of two scenarios. Either A, if the Federal Reserve went overboard with its interest rate hikes, because remember, the Federal Reserve hikes interest rates and then the economy adjusts. So there is lag between the policy change and how the economy reacts. On top of that, as I've said before, if inflation truly is sticky and the Federal Reserve has to pause its interest rate cuts, that can also increase the likelihood of recession. And now I want to give you my predictions on financial stability. Basically, how the average American feels in their financial position. Do they feel secure or not? Now currently, I think most Americans feel like we are in a recession, even though technically we are not. AKA, financial security, at least the feeling of financial security, is quite low right now. And this has to do with high prices. For lack of a better term, everyone feels poorer because they technically are. And in 2024, I don't think those feelings are going to change. And that's because the prices of goods are still very expensive, and while wages are finally outpacing inflation, it's going to take some time for them to catch up and overtake the inflation we've experienced over the last 2 years. And until that truly happens, people are going to feel poorer because their purchasing power is less. And even without recession, or even without sticky inflation, I don't think people's feelings of financial security are going to change much in 2024. But as wages hopefully continue to outpace inflation, maybe in 2025 or 2026, wages will have caught up for all the damage that inflation has done over the last 2 years, and maybe people will feel more financially stable. Now that wraps up part 1 of my economic predictions for 2024. So to recap my predictions for 2024, I believe interest rates will fall, but they will not come down to the levels that we were accustomed to. I believe inflation will remain more sticky than people are anticipating, and it will be harder to get it under 3% permanently than most people are anticipating. I think services inflation will remain high, and it will be the hardest metric to bring to the Federal Reserve's target rate. I think the job market and wage growth will remain strong in 2024, which is a good thing, but it also puts inflationary pressure on the economy. I think currently it looks like we're on the way to a soft landing, but this is very much contingent on inflation not flaring up again as the Federal Reserve cuts rates. I do not see a major recession over the next 12 months, but again, this is also contingent on inflation not flaring up, and it is also contingent on the Federal Reserve not having overdone it with interest rate increases over the last year. Remember, there is a lagging effect, so we are still not seeing the full effects of those interest rate hikes. But the next 12 months look relatively stable. And financial stability. I do not think people are going to feel more secure in 2024, unfortunately, because of the high prices. And until wages catch up and overtake inflation over the last 2 years, people are going to remain feeling poorer because they effectively are. Now that wraps up part 1 to my economic predictions for 2024. In part 2, which comes out this Friday, we will be covering wages, the real estate market, the car market, the stock market, and the bond market. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so you don't miss that video. And because this is a relatively new YouTube channel and it means the world to me, and I want to continue sharing this information with you guys for years to come. Other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you in part 2 on Friday for the rest of my 2024 economic predictions. Take care.